Good evening and welcome to the Baker Institute. My name is Bill Martin. I have the privilege to be and operate or organize and oversee the program in religion and public policy here at the Baker Institute. I think we're in for an interesting evening. The editors of Foreign Policy magazine and its British kinsman Prospect were understandably surprised when a spring 2008 poll designed to determine whom readers regarded as the world's leading public intellectual gave the top honor to a 67-year-old Turkish Muslim preacher and writer, Fethullah Gulen. The poll wasn't scientific, and the results were skewed by aggressive recruitment of votes from Mr. Gulen's admirers. But the fact that the 500,000 votes apparently came from separate individuals rather than a computerized robo-vote forced these publications and other observers to take a closer look. Assessment has been mixed, but there's no denying that Mr. Gulen is a figure of major significance with enormous significance and importance and impact in Turkey, mushrooming influence in the former USSR countries of Central Asia, and rapidly growing stature in other segments of the Muslim world, and an increasing influence in the United States. Despite Gulen's strong support of Turkish nationalism and his repeated insistence that he has no political aspirations, the popular respect that he has long discomfited the rigidly secular power structure that has dominated in Turkey since the time of Kemal Ataturk and until, especially in recent years, where that's been moderated a good bit. In 2002, I went to a program at the LBJ school in Austin, and they were talking about reflections on 9/11 at that time, among other things, and they were also a program of the Whirling Dervishes, which I had never seen and had long wanted to see. And I was just back from my first visit to Turkey with a group of Rice alumni travelers. I've been fascinated. I wanted to return, so I was just pretty interested in things Turkish. I met a number of congenial people there, and I learned their connection to Fethullah Gulen, of whom I had not previously heard. Over time, I came to know them a bit better, attending interfaith dinners and events held in Houston, including public lectures or widely announced lectures that included such luminaries as Secretary James Baker, Ambassador Jurijan here from the Institute, Secretary Madeleine Albright, Kofi Annan, I mentioned Madeleine Albright, former Mayor Bill White, and others. And I had repeated invitations to visit Turkey with my expenses paid. I was a bit skeptical about that. I checked with sources that I respected, and they said it's okay. I went in 2006 and again in 2009. If I had known that I would one day write about the movement, I would probably have declined those invitations, lest what I wrote would seem to be compromised. I'm glad I didn't know. Those visits have been highly rewarding and enlightening. In addition to the many fascinating sites in Istanbul, Konya, Izmir, Ephesus, Urfa, Haran, other places, I visited modern hospitals, leading newspapers, major television network, a university, and a number of first-rate secondary schools. I was most fascinated by the schools as an educator, and when I learned that people associated with this movement had founded a number of high-performing charter schools in Texas, several in Houston, all with harmony in their titles, I eventually set about to study them. And some of you may be aware that I had an article in the August issue of Texas Monthly, and it's available on the Baker Institute website, and I believe the URL for that, it was in the invitation, maybe it's in the program as well. But you're invited. You can, if you want to see it, you can visit at the program on religion and public policy, and it'll lead you quickly to that. As I noted in the Q&A that accompanies the discussion of the article, I have also developed warm and respectful friendships with many members of this movement. I have acknowledged that that may have affected my ability to be objective, but I've tried to be as fair and accurate as I know how to be, and I invite others to investigate matters for themselves. Still, there was much I didn't know and figured that I probably would never really learn. As a sociologist committed to fieldwork, I would have loved to have spent a year or more in Turkey living and observing people inspired by this Turkish imam, who is now, incidentally, living in Pennsylvania. But at this stage of my life and career, that really wasn't a viable option for me. So I learned from the writings of Dr. Jill Carroll, who's the former member of the Rice Religious Studies program and also the former director of the Bonyuk Center for Tolerance and Understanding, and from Professor Helen Rose Ebow, who is here, U of H professor, eminent sociologist. Both of them have written books about the Gülen movement, and also from a number of books written and published by members of the movement, and as well as a number of articles highly critical of Mr. Gulen and those associated with him. There's something of a polarization both in Turkey and the United States. Then, early this year, I read an article in the Journal of Power by a man named Joshua Hendrick, whom I had not previously known. And it rang true to me. And it led me to read his dissertation, which I am confident will soon be an important book. I learned that he had spent several summers, then almost a year in Turkey, living with people inspired by Mr. Gulen and taking a long and deep look at many of the aspects of this influential movement. It impressed me, so I invited him to come and be with us this evening. Dr. Hendrick approaches this multiplex topic as a sociological and anthropological analyst rather than either as an advocate or a critic. And because he makes some observations about the movement, including referring to it as a movement, which that causes some uneasiness, I thought it was appropriate to allow opportunity for response. And to that end, I have invited Dr. Alp Aslandogan, an extraordinarily learned and able man for whom I have great respect as well as affection, to respond as he deems appropriate. I'll give you a little vignette. On my last trip to Turkey with a small number of the heads of the major sociological scholarly organizations and journals, one day we were riding from Cappadocia to Konya in a small bus buffeted by high winds, and we asked, well, Alp, would you be willing to answer some questions? And he said yes. For the next 3 hours, he stood in the aisle and talked to us, never repeating himself, never groping for a word or a fact, and held our attention in a rapt way. All of us, including some prize-winning teachers, privately expressed our awe for that. So we have two real outstanding people here tonight. I regard this evening's event as an important occasion and believe we are fortunate to have such speakers to help us understand this truly significant social phenomenon. I could introduce our speakers further by reading to you what is written in your program, but since I'm confident that almost all of you read it at least grade level, that seems superfluous, and I've already taken enough time, so I think we should get right to their presentation. First, Dr. Hendrick will speak, and then Dr. Aslandogan will have an opportunity to respond for a bit, and then if they want to talk to each other, they can, and then they will gather here and we'll take your questions. But Dr. Joshua Hendrick.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Martin. And the Baker Institute as a whole, I just want to say thank you. This is, feel very welcome since I've been in Houston. And it's a pleasure to be here this evening to speak to you all about this topic. I also want to thank Dr. Alp Aslandogan before I begin. I think his presence here tonight, his acceptance to participate alongside me, as I'm sure there will be plenty of overlaps as well as plenty of disagreement between things that we have to say. But dialogue, specifically cross-cultural dialogue and interfaith dialogue, is a central component to the identity of what I will refer to as the Gülen Movement. And I think that Dr. Aslandogan's presence here tonight, as well as many people in the audience here tonight who affiliate in one way or another with the Gülen Movement, is indicative of this component of its identity, which is, I believe, is a sincere effort to foster intercultural and interfaith dialogue. Now, again, as Professor Martin said, I am a sociologist by training with a background in anthropology, so my research is primarily qualitative in nature. A couple of other preliminary points. I am not a Muslim, and I do not have any lineage in my family of Turkish national citizenship or ethnic identity of any sort. So I approach this topic, again, as Professor Martin said in his introduction, as an outsider in every which way possible. So what I will say tonight, what I publish, is very much an interpretation. It's an informed interpretation. It's based upon empirical research, but it is just that. It is an outsider interpretation, and that then leaves it up for debate. I'm of the opinion that knowledge is had in debate, not in definitive one side or the other. Again, why I think tonight will prove fruitful, especially later on. Now, I also want to say that while I admire much of the Gülen Movement's organizational success, as I think its organizational model is exactly what makes it both unique in the world of Muslim politics and Islamic identity movements, I am not a sympathizer of this movement. That said, although I'm critical of the movement's inclination for ambiguity, and although I think it has problems with transparency, I am not fearful of it either. I am approaching this topic as a topic of social science research. So having said that, I want to make 3 points tonight. The first is that the movement that's associated with the retired Turkish preacher, writer, and orator, Fethullah Gülen, it is a collective identity movement that very much relies upon the very effective support of a very tight-knit group of deeply loyal and supportive followers who constitute the upper echelons of the movement, and who compose what an early 20th century German social theorist Max Weber called a charismatic aristocracy. And is a group of deeply devoted individuals who are devoted to the identity of their charismatic leader. And it is their responsibility to make this leader more than a leader, just that, he is a charismatic. Second, I want to say that the strategies incorporated to reproduce a sense of community and purpose in the Gülen movement is a very instructive case by which we can observe how the teachings of a charismatic leader can become routinized and institutionalized as an avenue for social mobility in the global era specifically. But then I also want to make a third point, that as a collective actor in the Turkish context, the Gülen movement's preference for ambiguity when discussing its organizational model, while very effective and understandable in Turkey, is running up against a U.S. public sphere that is very uneasy with ambiguity when it comes to organizational capacity. And very well, it is, and it will likely continue to prove to be somewhat of an Achilles heel here. Now, I first went to Turkey in the summer of 2002, and that's when I learned about Fethullah Gülen. I was about to start a PhD program in sociology, and it was very quickly after I arrived in Turkey that I learned about this very influential person and very controversial person in many ways in Turkey. In November of 2002, right after I left, the so-called Islamist Roots Justice and Development Party came to power in Turkey. This party won 34% of the popular vote, which allowed it in the Turkish parliamentary system to take majority control of parliament as a single-party government. In 2007, the Justice and Development Party repeated that electoral success by increasing the percentage of the national vote to 47%. Now, the Justice and Development Party has gone to great efforts both within Turkey and presenting itself abroad, to reframe its Islamic identity to something that was something of the past and that it has split from Turkish Islamic politics. And it refers to itself now as a conservative democratic party. Now, in the context of Turkish society then, the party is not the only point of this emergence of conservative democracy. It is my effort to make an argument that the civil society coalition underneath the Justice and Development Party, while not necessarily the same thing, very much have interests that are aligned. And the Justice and Development Party is very much reliant upon the support it receives from this civil level, its civil society, and the most influential actor at that level is the Gülen Movement. Now, the Gülen Movement and its impact, a little bit of background. Fethullah Gulen emerged as a charismatic sermon leader in the late 1960s. At the time, he was an official appointed imam, or I should say, not an imam. He was a religious dignitary for the Ministry of Religious Affairs in Turkey. And in the late 60s, in the western coastal city of Izmir, there were a number of people who were quite taken by his particular interpretation of a pre-existing commentary on the Quran, which is very influential throughout Turkey, the Risale-i Nur, which refers to the collected teachings, writings, and letters of a gentleman named Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, who was very influential in the formation of the Turkish Republic in the early 20th century and remained very influential as a religious movement leader himself until his death in 1960. Now, in Izmir, followers of Fethullah Gulen in the early 1970s organized a series of dormitories for students to come together and to create a sense of community that would unite a sense of tradition and modern education as a non-contradictory sense of identity. In 1982, following a deeply penetrating military coup in Turkey, a number of those dormitories became private schools. And the first two private schools in Turkey that were affiliated with the Gülen Movement, or designated as such, were Fatih College in Istanbul and Yamanlar College in Izmir. And in the Turkish context, college means high school. Now, the focus in these schools, both Yamanlar, Fatih, and schools that opened throughout the 1980s throughout the country, focused on science and math as central to its curriculum. And in Gülen's teachings, there is a clear focus on the fact that science and mathematics are nothing more than a different way to talk about creation. It is just another story. The Quran and science are two versions of the same story. Now, as students began to outperform their competitors on nationwide science and math competitions and at university placement exams, it became very difficult for critics of what was referred to as the Gülen community at the time to support their claims of religious brainwashing of children at these schools. So throughout the 1980s, schools expanded throughout Turkey, and in the 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, schools expanded throughout Central Asia and into the Balkans. In the mid-1990s to late 1990s, schools expanded to Southeast Asia, to Sub-Saharan Africa, and to the United States and Western Europe. And in the 2000s, schools opened up in Latin America, North Africa, as well as Professor Martin said, the school choice movement here in the United States allowed for an opportunity space for the Gülen movement to take advantage of public funding here to create a situation whereby the United States now hosts more Gülen-inspired schools than any country in the world outside of Turkey. Now, in addition to education, schools provide inroads for affiliated Turkish capital that provides the startup capital for these schools and function very much as compradors around the world. They provide inroads to boost Turkish trade with affiliated businessmen back in Turkey. They also provide a space as an unofficial embassy for state dignitaries in the Justice and Development Party-led Turkey to visit these schools when they are abroad, especially in countries where there are no official embassies, specifically in Africa and throughout Southeast Asia. Now, the Deputy Prime Minister of the current Justice and Development Party government in Turkey, Bülent Arınç, he visited Uganda last week, and while there, he said as follows: teachers and administrators at these schools, as they had met him at the airport, have strong ties to the highest profile officials, as well as to civil society groups and even members of minority religions in those countries. For this reason, we should congratulate these educational efforts that were started with encouragement from the esteemed Fethullah Gülen, Hoca Efendi. This is an important gain for Turkey. Hoca Efendi is the honorary title given to Fethullah Gülen by those who admire him. It refers to esteemed teacher. And this is just a sample. Every time a Justice Development Party deputy or statesman visits a foreign country, they make an effort to visit the Turkish schools that are there in a growing pattern that clearly illustrates the fact that the redefinition of Turkish foreign policy is very much boosted by the activities of these schools abroad. Now, in addition to education, and in addition to representing the new Turkey abroad, the Gülen Movement and followers therein, sympathetic followers therein, also have Turkey's, they control what is now Turkey's 14th largest bank, its largest participation bank or interest-free Islamic bank. They have Turkey's largest business-related NGO. They have a media corporation that has 3 television stations, Turkey's most circulated news publication, its News Daily, its most circulated English news daily, its most widely read political news magazine, as well as there is also a first responder relief organization, Kimse Yokmu, the Turkey's largest educational supplier corporation, Kaynak Corporation, significant amount of publishing, 30 publishing labels officially just under Kaynak, and that's not including a number of other groups. An IBM partnered ICT firm, one of only 4 in Turkey, a major Turkish think tank and outreach group, and several dozen interfaith cultural and dialogue institutes throughout Western Europe and the United States. Now, why study the Gülen movement at all? Just very quick, I want to say that right now in the United States specifically, and in Europe as well, Islam is treated very much as something that is other, something that is alien, something that is opposite or strange. That our popular conversation about Islam is very static, very uniform, and very essentialist in how we talk about 1.7 billion people on earth as though they are all the same. Islamic activism in the 20th century, moreover, that is social movements that use an Islamic discourse to express their mobilization and yearning for social change, is an incredibly diverse, competing, and contradictory global phenomenon that can be compared, but by no means refers to the same thing. The Gülen movement specifically is noteworthy because of its engagement with, rather than its mobilization against, the structures of the global economy. Thus, my primary research motivations were to ask, why does Fethullah Gülen appeal both to Turks and to a cross-cultural constituency of sympathizers and admirers? What I realized was that, after I conducted a significant amount of ethnographic research, was that Fethullah Gülen, and by extension the Gülen movement, provides a brand of spiritually motivated activism that is very attractive to socially conservative, economically liberal-minded people who view math and science education as something that can thrive in the private sphere. I also found out that Gülen's impact as a leader is explained less by his own unique abilities than it is by the efforts of his most devoted followers. Now, again, I want to recall Max Weber's theory of charismatic leadership. By a charismatic aristocracy, Max Weber said as such, a staff and an apparatus of services and material means that is adapted to the mission of the leader. The personal staff constitutes this aristocracy, composed of a select group of adherents who are united by discipleship and loyalty, and who are chosen according to personal charismatic qualification. Now, it is from the efforts of this top-tier group of devoted followers that Fethullah Gülen has become, one, the most primary symbol of 21st century Turkey around the world, and Turkey's antidote to Al-Qaeda, or at least this is the brand that is presented. Now, a little bit about Gülen's teachings, the focus on education. Quoting him, he believes that today the happiness of humanity has been delayed, which sort of connects him to Islamic modernists and Islamic reformers, Muslim reformers throughout the 20th century, who believed that the decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries and the colonial onslaught of European colonialism throughout the Middle East and North Africa, that during that time humanity strayed from the righteous path. And thus, although it's sourced in Islam, Gülen's teachings in this regard is very typical of religious revivalism in general. Right? The world is lost in despair. It's corrupted by poor leadership and wallowing in immorality, materialism, and self-indulgence. I'll just give you one quote to this effect. This is from Fethullah Gülen. Humankind has never been so wretched as it is today. The table of art and literature is vandalized by drunks. Thought is capital wasted in the hands of people suffering from intellectual poverty. Science is a plaything for materialism, and the products of science are tools used in the name of unbelief. So Gülen, as a charismatic leader, is very comparable to other charismatic leaders throughout history. He has defined a crisis. It's a crisis in education and morality. He has recruited a loyal following, and he has offered them a vision for the future. Now, when I interviewed a number of people who I'm referring to as Gülen's aristocrats, when I asked them about the growth and success of this movement, one gentleman responded as such, quote, "Look, do you know what geometric probability is? Within science, I will tell you." And he grabbed a pen and he started jotting down a piece of paper in front of me. And he said, 1 and 1 equals 2, okay? 2 and 2 equals 4. 4 and 4 equals 16. 16 and 16 equals 256. 256 times 256. Do you get it? Would you reach 10 million by the time you arrive at the 100 set? This concept, and by that he meant the Gülen movement, has won geometrically. This is a mathematical progression. So I responded somewhat confused. I said, so at the beginning of our interview when you said that 10 years from now people in Turkey will have to sympathize with this movement, it's because it's just going to be so big? And he responded, absolutely. Well, not so big, so true. So similar sentiments of the truth of that underlines the Gülen movement was reiterated in interviews I conducted with a number of other very close and senior levels of this movement who refer to their Hoca Efendi, their esteemed teacher, as the most inspirational person, at least in their world today, who can offer the world a very focused and pronounced avenue to make the world a better place. Now, these are also the people, however, who are the first to say that when you want to talk about the Gülen movement, you have to be very careful about what you want to talk about. There was a recurring theme in my research in every interview I conducted with every senior member, or who I'm referring to as a senior member of, or higher up level member of the Gülen movement. The same phrase of the institutions that comprise the Gülen movement are not organically connected to one another came up again and again. And I tried to understand what exactly that meant. What is the Gülen movement? What is not the Gülen movement? When are we looking at the Gülen movement? When we see it, and when are we not? Now, again, just to highlight how these people think about Fethullah Gülen, a person who was a principal and administrator at a number of schools in Southeast Asia, who has now taken over to run a particular wing of the publishing at an organization that is called Kaynak Cultural Publishing. Internally, it's called the Academy in the movement. And when I asked him about why he was inspired by Fethullah Gülen, he said, quote, Fethullah Gülen possesses powers that an average educated person, an average person with an average intelligence, could not possibly imagine. It is God-given. If you find a more learned person in the world, I would like to meet him. When I asked why he went to go visit a different gentleman, senior level editor for Arabic publications, I asked him why he went to Pennsylvania to go visit Fethullah Gülen, and I hadn't seen him in a month, and he had just got back. And his response to me was, "Don't you miss your parents?" So there's a component of Gülen's teaching where he calls for the action, hizmet insanlara, service human, to go out and do service for the betterment of humanity. Now, because growth of the movement itself is framed as the betterment of humanity, what that means is that his most loyal followers view themselves as participating in an altruistic project for human salvation. More schools, more businesses, more media, more dialogue institutes, more conferences. There are no limits to its growth because we're talking about growth for saving the world. Now, what I found, however, was that when people talk about their first entrance to the movement, when they first met it, they do not talk about Fethullah Gülen at all. I found out that their love for Hoca Effendi, their love for their esteemed teacher, came much later. That when they talk about their first movement, what they talk about is the quality of education that they received at particular schools that they went to, the inspiration that they observed or that they got in the behaviors that they observed in their teachers. They talk about the subsidized rent that they received while they were at university, and when it was relevant, they talk about the assistance they got when they wanted to continue their education abroad in Europe or the United States. So I found that when it came to recruitment, motivation to participate in the Gülen movement was far from spiritual. So why education then? Just a little background on the Turkish context. In a 2004 World Bank study, Turkey's labor force was cited as lagging behind European norms. Turkey has 7 years of average schooling in the labor force compared to Europe's 10. And this primarily has to do with overcrowding. There are simply not enough seats in university classrooms specifically for the amount of university-aspiring youth in Turkey. This is a similar situation in a number of late industrialized countries. In Turkey, as many people in here can corroborate with me, the senior, what we would call a senior in high school, about to wanting to go to university, all they can focus on that year is the dreaded Öğrenci Seçme Sınavı, or the ÖSS. Right? It is the Turkey's version of the SAT. It means a lot more than the SAT does. It is the single solitary thing that gets you into university. And thus it has become very, very competitive. This then led to, the competition on the exam led to the rise of a competition in the market for the cram course, the Kaplan-style teach to the test supplemental education course that in Turkey are called dershaneler. Dershane in the singular. Now in 2002, Turkey's per capita purchasing power parity, the amount of money that on average compared to the US dollar the Turkish individual can spend in the market was $7,000. In 2002, in the same year, dershane prices on average cost students and their families nearly $1,300, and that's a little over 1/5 of an individual's capacity to spend. 57% of young people surveyed by the World Bank in 2005 indicated that they did not attend a supplemental dershane education course because of lack of financial capacity. In 1984, there were 174 dershane institutions around Turkey. By 2002, there were over 2,100. It's a roughly speaking $5 billion industry, $500 million industry in Turkey. So competition doesn't only exist between students, it exists between these companies that compete for their patronage. In every city in Turkey, following the publication of the results of the ÖSS, the student selection exam, banners are erected throughout all cities in Turkey that display different dershane companies and their students' successes on these exams. Now, in every single city in Turkey that at least I went to, dershane companies affiliated with the Gülen movement outperformed their rivals. Be it the nationally expansive FEM schools in Istanbul, Maltepe schools in Ankara, Yeşilırmak schools in Bursa, and elsewhere. These schools produced better, on average, test-performing kids than their rivals. So How does the Gülen movement appeal to the masses? One very important component to the answer to that question is the Dershane system in Turkey. The Gülen movement cornered this niche in the 1980s and 1990s, and at these schools, the Gülen individual students first learned of the Gülen movement through a market relationship. Now, after you test well on this exam, when you're on your way to university, in the interviews that I conducted with a number of people, both currently in the Gülen movement and people who wouldn't say that they are part of the Gülen movement, but who took advantage of these opportunities nonetheless, they got a call from their teachers at these Dershane schools and said, hey, I see here that you tested really well. Congratulations on the OCC. Do you have a place to live yet? There's this dormitory over here, or if you prefer, there's an apartment with a smaller amount of people living there. Subsidized rent, depending on what you can afford. Some will be totally subsidized, some will be less subsidized, depending on the family in which you're coming from. And these institutions, these dormitories and student apartments are referred to in the Gülen movement as houses of light. This is where you start to learn about Fethullah Gülen. It is at these houses where you start to participate in what is called a sohbet, which just means conversation in Arabic, and it historically refers to the conversation between a Sufi sheikh and his disciple. Whereas in the Gülen movement, the sohbet has been reframed to be a conversation circle where the teachings of Fethullah Gülen, Said Nursi, Turkish Islam, or papers such as that I've produced or other people like me have produced are read in these sohbet circles at more of the upper echelons of the sohbet circles. But it's here where you learn the identity of the movement, where you become sort of a hizmet insanlara, a hizmet person. There are opportunities then available to you as you continue to participate. Everybody starts to learn about all of the companies that donate and the business people that donate to this movement on a regular basis. The newspaper is increasingly larger media corporation, Feza Media. The bank, Tuscan as a trade organization, a number of small to medium-sized export companies. There are job opportunities available, and thus this is a very focused social mobility mechanism. It provides access to social mobility for an increasingly larger number of people in a country like Turkey where social mobility is relatively limited, or has been, especially in the 1980s and 1990s. Now, success leads to conspiracy. Gülen is infiltrating the state. He's producing the new elite, and they are infiltrating the Turkish establishment. This is a dominant conspiracy theory, or I should say a common conspiracy theory in Turkey, and it is as old as the Gülen movement itself. Now, this is because sort of what I would call classical 20th century Islamism was focused on seizing the state. This is the political movement that's epitomized by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the writings of Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Abdul al-Maududi in Pakistan. The efforts of these groups, at least initially, was to focus on seizing the state, implementing Sharia, and instigating some sort of an Islamic revolution. Now, this has been dramatically reformed throughout the world, and there's now a variety of Islamic identity movements, most of which are not very interested in seizing the state. Now, having said that, the observable overlaps between the Justice and Development Party in Turkey and its shift from classical Islamism to what it calls conservative democracy, and the Gülen movement's passive tactics to apply rather than to preach its brand of Islam, to live Islam versus then to proselytize as such, in many ways helps us to understand why these two collectives have managed to forge, at least so far, a very workable coalition in the new Turkey. Now, if the Dershane and recruitment and social mobility somehow explains the Gülen movement in Turkey, what factors explain its appeal outside Turkey? Right? What I realize is that the schools around the world are just as successful as they are in Turkey. Gülen inspired private schools, again, with startup capital provided by donating business people throughout the movement, and schools have emerged to get first in Central Asia, the Balkans, and then elsewhere. Profits, these are all private schools around the world, profits made are then reinvested in the schools to build new facilities, to build new campuses, and to expand as such. When proven effective, host states will offer official support. In 2008, the Ministry of Education in Nigeria, for instance, offered $340 million in scholarships to the Turkish schools in that country. Similar success is everywhere. So, the success of the Gülen movement, despite Gülen's aristocrats' claim that it's because of his grace and his truth and his powers, I say that it is not due to these powers. It is due to an organizational model that has provided a very effective and routinized way to teach math and science, to teach to the test, and to provide social networks and social capital where there is a demand for such. It is also then, you can't say that the motivation behind this movement is just a benign desire of its followers to foster peace and dialogue. There's clearly more at play. To view the Gülen movement as a specific community of selflessly dedicated individuals, how it brands itself, in my view, this simplifies the movement's impact. Which then leads me to how Fethullah Gülen is packaged for global consumption. There is a demand here in the West, so-called West, Western Europe, Australia, the United States, for something that we can call moderate or passive or liberal Islam. We're starving for it. And Gülen's aristocrats are very well aware of this. And they have packaged Fethullah Gülen as the answer to al-Qaeda, what you're looking for. He is democracy, he is peace, he is dialogue. It's a very conscious brand that is disseminated to very consciously selected people. People are selected around cities around the United States, people of influence, religious leaders, state bureaucrats, appointed officials, elected officials, police officials, academics, journalists are selected to tell you about Fethullah Gülen. Now, how this sort of what I call a public relations effort happens is by several different means. There are interfaith dinners that are sponsored by institutions like the Gülen Institute, the Institute for Interfaith Dialogue, and the Raindrop Foundation here in Houston. These institutions exist throughout the United States. Interfaith dinners, visits to mayoral offices and so forth, the offerings of awards of one form or another for people for whatever it is that they're doing, acknowledgement of their work. There are also conferences about the Gülen movement sponsored by the Gülen movement in an effort to control the story of the Gülen movement to a foreign audience. Not many people in this country know much about Turkey, and many of these conferences tell you about Turkey in the form of Fethullah Gülen. And there are an increasing number of these conferences. The first, as far as I'm familiar, there was one in Australia in 2000, 2002 at Georgetown. My first meeting of the Gülen movement was in 2005, right here at Rice University. And there is now, on average, about 3 of these conferences a year at universities around the United States, the most recent being in late November at Loyola University in Chicago, that was sponsored primarily by the Niagara Foundation, which is an equivalent of the Institute of Interfaith Dialogue here in Houston. Now, this demand is also fulfilled by, as Bill said, taking influential people of influence to Turkey on either full expenses paid or heavily subsidized trips, usually about 10 days, if I'm correct. And you go on a tour of the new Turkey. You'll visit the old city, and you will then visit a handful of tour sites, but you will also visit a number of schools, a few hospitals, perhaps some television stations in the media, and there is a public relations campaign, and there are then these trips of influential Americans in cities around the United States who are taken to Turkey, and then when they come home, if they're journalists, they write a story, if they're academics, they write a paper, and there is an effective marketing scheme to talk about and to say who and what Fethullah Gülen is. Now, is this demand being fulfilled? I say it is. But it perhaps is reaching its limits. Specifically in Russia and Holland, there has already been a backlash against the Gülen movement in recent years, and most recently right here in the United States, there is this growing backlash against the Gülen movement here, specifically talking about the charter schools that now comprise approximately 150 schools in many different states. Now, it's important to say that there is a conversation in Turkey about the point of these outreach activities, marketing activities, public relations activities. One supporter of the Gülen movement told me that their efforts are, quote, to show people how members of different religions can live together in peace. A critic of the movement told me this is akin to Turkish imperialism. The reality, however, is that when given a chance to control the story, to present it how they want to, the Gülen movement is very well aware of its political impact. Most recently, the 2010 inaugural of the Assembly of Turkic American Federations, two quotes I want to read to you that were given to the U.S. press talking about the significance of this event, which this event consolidated all of these dialogue groups in the United States under one umbrella. And when asked, a director of one of these groups said, the lobbying firms that have paid loads of money in Washington by Turkey actually worsen the image of Turkey at the Congress. Instead, civil grassroots visits, and by that he meant members of the Gülen movement visits, to congressional members, especially in their districts, make the biggest differences. Another director at another organization from another state in the U.S., said, Turkish constituencies maintain their close relationships with their congressional members and host them when it is possible for dinners and awards ceremonies with persistence. But while respectfully elaborating their cause, those Turkish grassroots in the U.S. become more convincing than the Armenians. Thus, although it contends that its primary objective is to foster dialogue, the reality is that in the 21st century, the Gülen movement is second only to the Justice and Development Party itself in promoting the foreign policy interests of the new Turkey. Now, how do we assess this here in the U.S.? There are a number of growing fears, specifically from alarmist critics who want to compare Gülen somehow to the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1978, waiting in exile until the time is right to return to Turkey to initiate his Islamic revolution. Now, I believe these accusations and assumptions are rather preposterous, but I do think that the movement's organizational tendencies towards ambiguity, and what I call a very strategic sense of ambiguity, or employment of ambiguity, and a general lack of transparency about the flows of people, money, and authority invites skeptics to criticize the movement's aims and its public persona. Moreover, again, I want to quote Max Weber, who said that every charismatic is on the road from a turbulently emotional life that knows no economic rationality to a slow death of suffocation under the weight of material interests. Now, in the United States, charter schools provide an alternative for parents here who are not satisfied with public education. Charter schools are run typically by what are called charter management organizations, or non-for-profit organizations. If they're for-profit, they're called education management organizations. The biggest in the United States, at least acknowledged as such, KIPP Schools, Knowledge is Power program, has 99 schools in 20 states, and Imagine Schools has 73 schools. Now, most charter management organizations are not that nationally expansive. Most are state-defined or small, regionally defined. That said, the Cosmos Foundation and Harmony Schools right here in Texas, with 33 schools here in Texas, and then one in Tennessee, as far as I know. Magnolia Schools and Willow Education in California. Concept Schools that has schools in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. Daisy Education in Arizona, and this only names a few. What links these smaller competitors to KIPP and Imagine is that their administrators, many of their teachers, as well as, more often than not, their architects, their educational material suppliers, or at least some of them, are all affiliated with Fethullah Gulen. Thus, organizationally autonomous, yes, they are, but linked by ideational networks, linked by social networks, linked by client relationships, linked by a sense of how we are to do what we are to do. Now, I visited today a Harmony School. And the superintendent of Harmony Schools told me something that I've read in media that he has said elsewhere, that there is no connection to this school and to Harmony schools in general to the Gülen movement. Now, that's something that superintendents and administrators and principals at charter schools around the country are saying in a near verbatim way. There is no institutional affiliation between these schools and Fethullah Gülen or with the Gülen movement. Now, there are a number of criticisms that are coming out, administrative denials of affiliation being one of them. There's a suspect practice of sponsoring H-1B foreign visas for Turkish and Turkic teachers to come from Turkey or Central Asia to teach at the schools at the expense of out-of-work American teachers, which has some people, specifically teachers, alarmed. I became aware of all this not by looking for it. In the spring of 2009, I received contact from a self-identified concerned parent in the United States. I was a father of a teenage woman she had been at a charter school in a U.S. state for 2 years. And this dad was a natural scientist, he said, and he was very pleased with the math and science education that his daughter was receiving. In the fall of 2009, he said that he participated in a school board meeting for the first time. And he noticed at that meeting that 100% of the administrators were Turkish males. 100% of the board members were Turkish males. He said, quote, "Eventually, I began to feel concerned. What began to concern me was their reaction to any sort of questioning or disagreement with school policies, the degree to which they simply could not tolerate it, and the manipulative and forceful manner in which they responded struck me as distinctly abnormal. Formerly a staunch supporter of the school, I began to suspect that something just wasn't right." And he took to the internet after he realized this, and when he said that he, quote, "began to feel alarmed when he found all the contradictory information about Fethullah Gülen. Was he a radical Islamist comparable to Khomeini, or is he interfaith dialogue that has mobilized 2 generations of socially motivated and inclusive activism?" When we concluded our discussion, he wanted to know more than anything else, why did the principal at his daughter's school deny affiliation to the Gülen movement when, according to this man, it was very, very clear. So after this concluded, it was about a week and a half later, very curious thing happened. I got another email from another parent in another U.S. state. This person said that, quote, they were representing a group of concerned parents that included 9 families. This happened over the course of about 7 months, and by May 2010, I received over a dozen communications from self-identified concerned parents from 5 different U.S. cities. At the same time, I received a number of emails from local and national media wanting to know about these Turkish charter schools all over the country, as well as from labor union organizers who wanted to talk about allegations of gender discrimination, of suspect hiring practices, and of the foreign H-1B visas, and what I could talk to them about. Now, on the internet, then, there is this relatively loud backlash that's happening by self-proclaimed watchdogs, many of which are teachers, former parents in Arizona, Utah, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Texas, and elsewhere. Most of the extreme claims are deeply Islamophobic and very uncomfortable for me to read, knowing this movement very well. But according to one, Turkish Muslims are, quote, infiltrated in the U.S. through our charter schools. Now, the primary data used for this infiltration argument, is the H-1B visa applications. There are a very high number of foreign worker visa applications applied for by all of these charter schools. Harmony schools, for instance, in in Houston, Harmony Schools and Cosmos Foundation together applied for more foreign worker visas than any other educational group in the United States. This includes any county or public school or private school. Now, on the list of top 25, 9 more Gülen-inspired schools or charter schools were bringing in large numbers, or at least applying to bring in large numbers of Turks. Now, it's very interesting then when principals are denying affiliation, because most recently when talking about these charter schools, there was a USA Today article on the charter schools by Greg Topo a few months ago. And he sent a list of questions to Fethullah Gülen in Pennsylvania, specifically asking about his leadership in the movement. Gülen said as follows, quote, "It is well known that I have no relation with any institution in the form of ownership, board membership, or any similar kind. I do not approve that those who are familiar with and share these ideas and opinions to any extent, or the institutions that they work at, should be viewed as connected with my person. This is a common thing that Fethullah Gülen has said repeatedly throughout the years. Now that said, Gülen's 2008 immigration case here in the United States actually became quite a back and forth between his legal team and the Department of Homeland Security, who was trying to revoke his temporary citizenship and not allow his permanent residency, which his legal team had applied for, based on the fact that, quote, he was an alien of extraordinary ability in the field of education. Now, according to his own legal team, Gülen was, quote, the leader of the Gülen Movement, and B, the foundation for hundreds of schools across 3 continents. So who are we to believe in terms of accurately defining Gülen's role as a leader of the movement, Gülen's lawyer, or Gülen himself? And when you read the denials or learn the denials of affiliation by principals, just to give you one example of a charter school superintendent in a U.S. state, when asked by a local journalist about the connection to the school to the Gülen movement, quote, we would like to stress and underline the fact that the establishment of our charter company was not and is not linked to any movement that can possibly have any substantive influence on any school's mission, vision, or operations. Our company cannot and does not have any control over its employees' inspirations or beliefs. If any of our employees are inspired by Mr. Gülen, it does not suggest that as an institution we have an institutional affiliation or guidance from Mr. Gülen. So what is mind-boggling to some and infuriating to others is, why do leaders deny affiliation when affiliation is clear? And it seems to me that we have a communication breakdown. There is a cross-cultural miscommunication that is happening that is leading to increasingly divisive conversation in the United States that is 30 years old in Turkey. So, by way of conclusion, I want to offer one of the last parents who contacted me was very sad that this was happening in her community, and she was really happy with the education that her 3 sons were receiving at charter schools that she had learned were Gülen inspired. And what she said to me was as follows: why doesn't the school acknowledge a link to other schools? If I had been told that this school was linked to a successful Turkish academic model, I think I would have been interested in looking at other schools, its accomplishments. Instead, I feel uninformed and concerned. Why isn't there an open dialogue about the Gülen influence on the academic model? This person was taken to Turkey or was about to go to Turkey on a sponsored trip, and she had said, as she was wondering if she should go, our tour of Turkey includes time at Çoşkun College and Fatih University. My guess is some of our administrators likely attended these schools, and from my limited research, they definitely look related to Fethullah Gülen. So I just want to say that unlike Hamas in Palestine or Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Gülen movement did not emerge as a nationalist liberation organization. Unlike Jamaat Islami in Pakistan or even the Milli Görüş in Turkey, it did not morph into a political party. Instead, the Gülen movement mobilized to become a hyper-rationalized, profit-driven, and opportunistic composite of social networks that over time institutionalized the charisma of a Turkish Islamic preacher into an effective, nonviolent, cooperative force for conservative social change. Now, that said, it also has a problem with its strategic use of ambiguity, discussing its organizational form, and a general lack of transparency that will likely lead to an increasingly divisive conversation here and elsewhere. And considering Turkey's emerging role as a 21st century political and economic power, as a European Union candidate, as well as a critically important, albeit strained ally of both Israel and the United States, the significance of this movement in Turkey is not only significant for 75 million Turks, but for the entire world. And I will conclude there. Thank you.
If you agree with everything.
How many hours did I have? All right. It's going to be a challenge for me to try to summarize my comments, objections, corrections, but I'll try my best. First of all, a couple of disclaimers. In the advertisement for this event, Bill talks about a leading intellectual by the name of Alp. I'd like to meet that person when he arrives. I'm not that person. I would like to think that I can think for myself, but that's about it. The second disclaimer is I'll be speaking personally. It is my personal opinion. It doesn't represent the organization where I serve as the board director or any other organization. It's a strictly personal opinion. Let me begin with listing a few points that I agree with Joshua. Not necessarily in this presentation tonight, but I had a chance to actually read his paper in the Journal of Power. I agreed with his conclusion there partially, where he suggested that, and let me read it from the paper itself. All right. He concluded that the collective effort, where Gülen Movement is a part, seeks less to Islamicize the Turkish society than it does to manufacture a Turkish Islamic ethic of capitalism, a socially conservative and economically liberal worldview that strives to increase and legitimize the Muslim share in Turkey's political economy. I partially agree with this assessment. Definitely for a new generation of business people, professionals, and ordinary people, especially the educational activities of the Gülen Movement provided them with opportunities for upward social mobility. Nobody can deny that. And I also agree that, I guess it was your second point, that this social mobility opportunity or educational opportunity is a very important attractive point, factor of attraction for Turkish citizens to become participants. And in interviews in Turkey, when I had a chance to accompany Dr. Iba, many people that she interviewed spoke similarly that the first time they met with some institution that is affiliated with the movement was an education institution, and that provided them with either a scholarship or an educational opportunity. And I think essentially this is a good thing because the Turkish economy has been doing very poorly, and a very large, maybe 80% of Turkish population have been denied opportunities for participation in the institutions of the country for many decades. And the reason for this denial goes back to the formation of Turkish Republic, and I'm not going to go in there. But there was an ideological difference, a school of thought that emphasized an elitist, particular worldview that championed the French-style militant laicism, elitism, and authoritarianism. Basically denied the vast population of Anatolia, the mainland Turkey, opportunities in government institutions and in economy. So what the institutions affiliated with the Gülen Movement was to give this opportunity to a sizable segment of Turkish population. This doesn't mean the people who have eventually become affiliated with the movement, there is no spirituality in there. I think spirituality was still the dominant factor, but the social mobility, the social capital definitely played a role. I think nobody can deny that. Joshua's first point, I have some commentary on that. I think 80%, 20%, 80% I don't agree with his point. 20% I think he has some points that can be justified. Gulen and charismatic leadership. I think there is a problem in the analysis of an emergent social movement. We have categories that have been defined by people like Weber or other sociologists some decades and centuries ago. And when we try to present these new phenomena, we feel like we have to put them into one of these categories. So we take Gulen and look at the categories. There's the charismatic leader category, seems to fit best. So we present him as a charismatic leader. Obviously, Gulen has some elements of charisma. He is very influential. Many people are at awe how influential he is. But to reduce this social phenomena to the charismatic leadership, I think, is injustice at the least. Maybe Gülen's charisma or the charismatic elements in Gülen's personality, education, preaching, or thought does play a role in there, but that's it. It cannot be reduced to charismatic leadership. I would like to offer an alternative paradigm for how Gülen personally and the movement as a social phenomenon was so effective, so successful in a very short time. So we're talking starting in the 60s, maybe a handful of people around Gülen, his first friends and students. This is the early 60s. And then when we talk about the 90s and now into the 21st century, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, potentially millions of people, who are somehow associated or affiliated with the movement. So there is definitely a big success story there. So my alternative paradigm for that is the sugar crystallization experiment, if you can remember that from the school days. You take a glass of water or put water into a container, and then you begin heating it, and you put some sugar in it, and you put sugar until it comes almost to the boiling point, and you cannot put any more sugar into it. It doesn't dissolve. Then you begin cooling it down. And then at some point, you let a little sugar crystal into this pot. And as you cool down, you see that that little crystal becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And all of a sudden, you have a large, big sugar crystal in this pot. Now, that sugar was already in there. That little crystal did not introduce additional sugar into it. But that little crystal helped the sugar in the water crystallize around a certain point. I think the impact of Gülen and the movement can be summarized with this example. The elements, the cultural, the traditional elements which mobilize people in the movement, Gülen did not invent any of them. The concept of charity, the concept of volunteerism, the concept of dedicating one's life to a higher cause. All of these elements can be traced to either Turkish or Islamic traditional elements. But they were dormant. After seeing decades and decades of corruption in their government officers, in their politicians, Turkish people have become disillusioned. And in the person of Gülen and his close friends, what Joshua calls aristocrats, I have an objection to that too, but in that set of people and the later students and the participants, Turkish people saw in them something that they lacked for decades, that is trust. They saw people they can trust. They can trust with their money, trust with their children. And this trust was that crystal. And Gülen sometimes in his little speeches refers to this as a credit card that the Turkish people gave to Gülen or to the movement. And he says this is the biggest asset of the movement, the trust, the credit of trust. And I call it the limitless and interest-free credit card that the Gülen movement has. So I think Gülen's personal qualities and influence and sincerity and the fact that he never owned any property or money, to this day he lives a very, not an impoverished life, but he doesn't own anything. That life has had an impact. His rhetorical power definitely had an impact, but that's just one aspect when you look at this larger phenomenon, and it cannot be reduced to that concept of charismatic leadership. I already commented about the recruitment strategies and importance of social mobility, that I agree that it is an important factor, it cannot be denied. But definitely spirituality did play a role. And when you look at the discourse, the literature that the people who eventually become involved with the movement that they read or discuss, spirituality is at the core of that literature. So I think maybe a separate study is needed to see where the balance is. How much is the social mobility or capital influencing people, and how much other aspects are influencing the people. Okay, before I talk about the ambiguity aspect, let me say a few things about the public relations, what Joshua referred to as public relations effort. Although initially Joshua said that he was just studying the movement as a social phenomenon, when he was talking about this, I sensed a little bit of cynicism. He didn't seem to me like a very neutral observer at that point. When you put yourselves into the shoes of the participants in this movement, they live in a society, the Turkish society, which is seen from outside as a shining star of secular democracy in the Middle East. But for those who know the story, it has never been secular or democratic. This has been a country which saw 4 actual military coups and several attempted coups, in which hundreds and thousands of people died or tortured or disappeared. Hundreds of thousands of citizens have been blacklisted by government officers, sometimes military officers. And people brought to courts that are heavily under pressure, people sentenced. We are talking about a society who went through this experience over and over again, at least 4 times. 1960, 1971, 1997 definitely, and 1980. At least 4 times have been gone through this experience. And Joshua mentioned in his paper that some of the organizations affiliated in the movement, educational organizations, actually function as a company, not as a foundation, as a charitable foundation. And the primary reason for that is so that if there is a military coup, the foundation's assets will not be confiscated by the junta. So we're talking about this kind of a historical background. So what would you expect participants in such a movement, how would you expect them to present themselves? How transparent can they be in their country? Now, you can make an argument, not that they have not been transparent, but you can understand that they cannot be as transparent as a citizen of the United States. Example, in the US, when you donate to a charitable foundation, you can be proud of it, you can display the name somewhere, and then you get a tax credit for it, or your tax is reduced. In Turkey, for many decades, you would be blacklisted. The government could come after you to demand more tax, because apparently you are giving, you should have more money. And you face persecution at the next military coup. So can this person be transparent about his donation to a foundation? So to understand the behavior or the actions of the participants, we have to consider the larger context, historical, political context. Otherwise, it is, again, is not a just assessment of the behavior, of the apparent behavior. So related to this, Joshua mentioned that this movement is presented as an antidote to Al-Qaeda. Well, all social sciences and history is witness to the track record of Mr. Gülen and the record. So I think to say that it's presented as an antidote to Al-Qaeda is, again, it's a little bit cynical. It is an antidote. As a matter of fact, I talked with the editor-in-chief of the Zaman newspaper, where Gulen actually writes, that was something that, a minor thing in the paper. Gulen actually writes in that a piece named Kürsü. Gulen at one time gave an interview after 9/11 to, if I remember correctly, Milliyet or some other paper, not Zaman. And then he called in that interview Bin Laden a monster. He said he has become a monster, and the people around him, if they think like him, they have become monsters. Can you find a more critical, a more lambasting view of Al-Qaeda than this? If you know, please let me know. And this has been his track record for decades. So, I mean, to say that it is presented like an antidote, I think it's a bit cynical. And because Zaman has been so critical, so rejecting of terrorism, the editor-in-chief told me that he personally received death threats from Al-Qaeda. So just to give you some facts about the history of this stance. And I think Dr. Akbar Ahmed recently said that if former President George Bush and Mr. Gülen were in the same room, Taliban would attack Gülen first, not President Bush. And let me say maybe a few words about the schools where Gülen influenced individuals serve as teachers or administrators, and also the conferences. Let me say something about the conferences first. The motive for organizing and helping organize social science conferences comes from this the same background. In Turkey, when it comes to analyzing or talking about the movement for a long time, for many decades, there were just a handful of individuals, Turkish individuals. And when there is such a controversy in Turkey that is not unique to the movement, it is a controversy about democracy, essentially. When there is such a controversy, and when there is a handful of social scientists who are Turkish, who possibly have some baggage when they talk about the movement, I think it makes perfect sense to try to increase the social scientists interested in the movement and study it without the baggage of a Turkish person. As far as I am concerned and the people that I know concerned, this was the motive for inviting and facilitating social science research into the movement and organizing events where social scientists can discuss their views. Now, Joshua himself studied the movement by living with the people from within the movement. And he's not Turkish, he's not Muslim. And people around him have no idea of what he plans to do with this data. If this is not transparency, what transparency is, I don't know. Another example, Dr. Bernard Turam, who is a feminist, who wrote a book, who studied the movement by spending time with the women in the movement. And in her book, she has both respect, praise, and criticism for the movement. She criticized certain aspects of the women's roles and places. Example, she thinks that the movement doesn't give enough political power for women to negotiate their political rights in the political area. She has some criticisms. And she also praises Gülen's contribution to women's education by saying that education is more important than the headscarf, educational opportunity, when the girls were not allowed to go to college with the headscarf. So this lady, this social scientist, studied the movement by, again, spending time with the movement participants for a very long time, maybe months and years. And she published her book. And in the book, there are severe criticisms. And she is not blacklisted by anybody. She still can go and study movement further. So if this is not transparency, what is transparency? Finally, about okay, I'm sorry. One more point before. Joshua mentioned that there were backlashes in Holland and Russia. These are very complicated stories, actually. They are very politically involved. Let me just give you a hint. There was a backlash in Russia. A school was closed. Okay. Why was the school closed? You can say it was a backlash against the PR campaign or something. Let me give you some other information. The son of a very prominent Maoist in Turkey, who studied in Russia, who took a position in a Russian university, and who lobbied Russian officers, government officials, to close down the school. And possibly, according to one author that I read, gave assurances to some military contractors for the purchase of Russian military equipment if the schools are closed down. Now, to verify such a claim, I would look at the sales of military equipment by Russian equipment and then the closing down of the school. So it is not very simple to analyze these, what is called a backlash. Okay, just as an example. If you go into this, we'll spend hours. But finally, about the school phenomenon, Joshua mentioned that some parents expressed concern about certain practices at schools. And then he mentioned that he had 12 communications in 5 cities. As far as I know, my son goes to a school that Joshua mentioned in this part of the city. As far as I know, in that school system, they have, in some schools, for an admission of 400 students, 500 students, they have a waiting list of 1,500 parents. So against the concerned parents set of 12 people, we have 1,500 people for one campus who are waiting to enroll their students in these schools. And the parents whose children who are actually in the schools, who are better witnesses and experts to ask about the school performance and the practices there? Just a handful of people who write emails, or those parents whose children are actually in these schools? Let me give you one example that I know. I know one parent who brings his son, I think about 30 miles from Katy to this school location. And his son was suffering from bullying at this previous school. And his father heard about this school where such individuals practice education. And he brought his son to the school, and his son later became a top performing student, and I think he won an award in the top 100 of the US. Such a talent. And every day he brings his son 30 miles each way to the school from Katy. So there are, I think, at least tens of thousands of parents who witness every day the school performance, the teachers, and the practices. I think when you put them in balance, there's no question that these schools are doing an excellent job. There may be concerns, and wherever there are humans, there are bad apples. If I can say one sentence, I think if the attitude toward transparency or ambiguity, if it is not as we would expect from a typical US citizen or an organization, I think it has to do with both the history in Turkey and some of the reflexes and some of the subconscious concerns that people have. But it also has to do with a phenomenon that I will call guilt by association. Because when people level their criticism against a school or other individuals or organizations, they don't do it as a social scientist would do. I mean, they say things like, you know that this school is governed by people who are under influence or followers of somebody like Khomeini. Okay, this is the kind of attack that is leveled. So the reaction and the response to this is definitely would not be as you would expect from a typical citizen or typical organization. So the kind of attack and their motivation, in a sense, influence the kind of the response. Thank you for this opportunity.
We try to keep our programs to no more than 90 minutes, and we will stick by that, which gives us very short time. But if you have questions, just a few questions that you'd like to ask, and you all want to come over here and sit there, and if, yes. Sorry.
Why is Imam Gülen living in Pennsylvania? Is he a political or religious exile from Turkey, or does he have problems in living in Turkey? What
There are two stories, I would say. Do you want to?
You
can go ahead first, right?
I can provide my.
As far as I understand, Fethullah is not a healthy man, and he originally came for
he's how old?
medical treatment.
How old is he now?
It depends on when you read his biography. He's either born in 38 or 41. If it's published before 2000, he's born in 38. If it's published after 2000, he's born in 41. So he's 67 to 70. But he came here in 1998 for health reasons, or it's also in the context of what's referred to in the Turkish context, the postmodern coup of the February 28th process, whereby there was a crackdown on a party that was in power at the time, and all religious communities had sort of a short-term persecution that happened from the state level. And just before that happened, Gulen had come to the U.S. for medical treatment. So the conspiracy in Turkey is that he was tipped off that this was about to happen and got out. But of course, this is not. He came for medical treatment and then did not return because the climate would not permit his return. And then since, as far as I understand from what he says, that his return would cause divisive conversations that he considers to be unproductive. So he'll just stay. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would basically agree with that. I think many people will try to capitalize on his return as an event as a political opportunity. The opposition in Turkey to the governing party hopes to gain by associating the movement with the governing party. They try to basically damage both sides. Because Gülen's rhetoric has always been that the endorsement of a political party is a no-no. If you like to participate in these institutions, then you have to be able to work with everybody of all political orientations. So there is a desire to associate the two, and Gülen's return to Turkey would give a golden opportunity for that. So I think he is hesitant not because of any legal reason, but because of this concern. He's hesitant to go back. But I think he definitely wants to go back. He said that he wants to go back strongly. He misses his home country strongly. We'll see if he feels comfortable.
Incidentally, it is important to mention, and I think either of us did, there were charges brought against him of conspiracy to overthrow the state, the secular nature of the Kemalist state, and he was vindicated of all things by both court and the Higher Court of Appeals in 2006. So since 2006, there's absolutely no legal reason for him not to return. But before 2006, he would have been arrested upon landing.
In the back there, sir? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I would like to ask, as far as I know about this movement schools, they teach Turkish mostly. And I know that I'm from Turkey and I'm Kurdish. And what is your movement stand for Kurds? And why we don't see those harmony schools in southeast of Turkey? And the second thing I would like to ask that, what is your movement stand for the missionaries in Turkey? Just like I consider you as a missionary of Islam, what would you consider the Christian in Turkey going free around and share gospel? What do you guys think?
The first question, was it heard by everybody? The movement's position vis-a-vis the Kurdish population in Turkey and the teaching of Turkish language. As far as the Kurdish population in Turkey, there are two aspects. One aspect is the Kurdish population in Turkey have been demanding cultural rights for decades. And this has caused a lot of problems. And some of them might have also wanted separation, but it's the general opinion that most Kurds don't want that. They basically want to have cultural rights that are equivalent of the European Union. And this position has been supported by movement-related media organizations. The recognition of the language, to be able to use the language for broadcasting. As a matter of fact, as far as I know, there is a movement-related broadcasting organization in Southeast Turkey which broadcasts in Kurdish. And Gülen expressed his views on how to resolve the Kurdish issue. If I remember correctly, he mentioned that economic opportunity is very important, that people should invest in that region, and he, as far as I know, he personally encouraged investors, entrepreneurs to invest in the region. He said that the opinion leaders in the region who are pro-peace, non-violent, should be strengthened. And the military measures that are needed against terrorist organizations, they should be used with caution. This was his opinion in resolving this issue. But more important than that, in that region there are different types of educational organizations in Southeast Turkey, and there are thousands of them actually. The first type of organization is a private school that is paid normally, but they have 20 to 25% scholarship quotas. So they would give this to the children with basically no money in their families. But more important than that, there are what are called the tutoring centers. These are completely free tutoring centers which prepare the students for both high schools and college exams that Joshua mentioned, which are so critical. And last time I visited Diyarbakir, I spoke with a representative there. They told me in one city in Southeast Turkey, they are serving 10,000 students in one city, all for free. And he said that from this group, we were able to put hundreds of students into law school, medical school, and engineering school. And even in villages, there are reading rooms for the adults and for children who cannot go to the city or the other centers. So there is a book on this. Mr. Mehmet Kalyoncu studied the contribution of Gülen-inspired education institutions to the social upward mobility of the Kurdish citizens, Kurdish children and youth. And you can find some more specific data in there. Now, the teaching of the Turkish language in schools, especially in Central Asia, but in other places as well, that I have to express my personal opinion. First, I think that the Turkish citizens who take positions in those schools and organizations, just as an American would believe that what America represents is helpful for the world. Values such as democracy, values such as rule of the law. So an American living abroad would find it educational and beneficial to teach English language so that the values that America represents can be understood and lived in those lands. Again, my personal opinion, I think the Turkish citizens who serve in these institutions have a belief that there are values that are in Turkish culture that are helpful for wherever they are serving. And that should be shared, and the language is a mechanism to share these values. And I think, again, personal opinion, I think they would like to see the interactions and the relations between those countries and Turkey increased. And again, I think they see this as something positive, not just for Turkey, but for the world in general. And nationalism might play a role for some of those individuals, but I have never done an assessment of that.
My second part, please, I would like to...
could you remind me about the second part?
As yourself or any other...
Oh,
the missionaries, okay. The Christian missionaries in Turkey, there are two things that can be said. One of them is a theoretical position. I never heard something from Mr. Gülen personally. I read something personally, but I read a person who writes, and I know that he visits with Mr. Gülen very often. He expressed in his book or article someplace, he said that a Muslim should have no problem, a Christian person living in a Muslim land, expressing, living, and preaching his faith. I don't know if this represents Mr. Gülen's personal opinion or any other institution, but I heard this from a person who visits with him and publishes books. Now, in Turkish media, and some of these media elements might be affiliated with the Gülen movement, there have been negative characterization of some missionary organizations. And usually these do not revolve around simply just being missionary, but abuse or offering some services in exchange for agreeing to read something or accept something. So those criticisms are not leveled against Christianity or missionaries per se. And I should also mention that in Turkey, the staunchest opponent of the Christian missionaries is a new phenomenon called the neo-nationalists. I am actually getting emails from those circles because one of my relatives is a member of that movement. In the neo-nationalist movement, there are always emails about what Christian missionaries are doing. They are putting money into the Bibles and things like that, renting rooms and giving them free for people to embrace Christianity. So this negative propaganda is prevalent among the neo-nationalists. So those are the group who are most vocal about Christian missionaries in Turkey.
Okay, let's take one here in the front, and we'll take a couple more. The people who have hands up, we'll have to stop then.
Just a quick comment. I am a non-Muslim Christian female member of the board of Cosmos Foundation that operates the Harmony Science Schools. And Turkish is not the only language that's taught in the schools. Children take that if they choose to take it. The other thing is that in the last 3 years, I've had 4 complaints referred to me if a family member, and not in Houston, but in other parts of Texas, has complained to the Texas Education Association. They refer them to me, and I talk with Dr. Tarim, and I want you to know what interests me is not a one of those complaints is about the school. As such, the complaint is, my child has been told he may not or she may not return, and I want my child back in that school.
Actually, I'm very surprised that you are great scholars having an access to both Turkish and English literature about Gulen. And unfortunately in Turkey, 90% of people don't have any access to English literature about Gulen, especially negative literature, because they don't speak English. And 99.9% in the United States, they don't have any access to Turkish literature about Gulen. And the opposers of Gulen in Turkey say that Gulen is a close friend of Uncle Sam, man of CIA, and American man. And here, because the people's fear in Turkey is about America, but here people's fear is about Islam. So the opposers say that the people here fear about Islam or Al-Qaeda. So Gülen is infiltrating in the United States. So what would you say about the discrepancy between the languages? Because to both audiences, they criticize totally different things. Can a person be extreme Islamic and also man of CIA at the same time?
And some of this is done by the same people. Writing in English one message, and in Turkish an opposite message, as if there are no bilingual Turks. And yes, one last question here.
Well, can I respond to you?
Oh yeah, sure.
I really like your question. That's the larger point that I really wanted to make is exactly your point. In my opinion, what I completely agree with Alp's assessment. The backlash right now is small, very small, but it just started. Right? There's a little bit you can trace back to 2006, as far as I've traced it back, but it's small. But there is a backlash. There are a couple schools that have been closed and then reopened and put on a probationary period. The concern of the schools, if it ever is discussing anything about Turkishness or Islamness, this is what I find to be not the point, right? The schools are most certainly have proven themselves both in the US, in Turkey, and around the world as being very effective. There's an educational model that clearly works. Clearly a high quality education. It's clearly making I have no problem believing over 98% of all parents who have children at these schools are very, very happy with these schools. What I wanted to communicate is what seems to be as a problem that might emerge is specifically, and it happened to me today, when the superintendent or the principal administrators at schools say that we are not part of the Gülen movement. There's nothing here part of the Gülen movement, right? That conversation, there needs to be a shift in the presentation, because the word affiliation doesn't just mean legal sort of organizational union, right? Affiliation means connections between social networks, between people who are all part of a larger identity movement. I believe that, I completely concur with all, that the culture of ambiguity is perfectly understandable in the context of the secular fortress of 20th century Turkey. Makes absolutely perfect sense about why the discursive strategies to explain what is and what is not part of a religious community. My point is, because it is Turkish, there is a culture of ambiguity. My point is that doesn't seem to be translating in the US context, where Islam is a very static and monolithic thing for most people, at least in our collective conversation. And if Islam is spoken, all of a sudden, certain images come to play. The media frames things in a certain way. And by claiming that Gulen is somehow an antidote to Al-Qaeda, in my opinion, allows that conversation to continue. Because Islam is not one thing, so no one Muslim can be an antidote to any other Muslim. Islam is Islam. Individual people and groups engage in politics in a variety of different ways, despite how they frame whatever it is they do. Gulen's no more an antidote for Al-Qaeda than Al-Qaeda is the antithesis of Gulen. I think that conversation is destructive.
Okay, one more question, then we'll stop there. As much as I think it would be fun to enjoy.
Criticism I found Mr. Aslandogan's comments very disturbing. First being Turkey being a militant secular state from the start, and some people are denied education. I will ask you to give me one example from the first day of Turkish Republic, 1923, up to the day Gülen Movement started, and then from the day Gülen Movement started up to today, one person who was denied education in Turkey. The second thing is I found very disturbing. You said you criticized Dimitri Kuz. I'm with you with that, especially the last one, 1980. It was very destructive in Turkey. Political parties closed, leaders were imprisoned, and so on. But one fact I find very disturbing: Fethullah and his supporters voted yes for the constitution following the military coup. And now you are criticizing the military coup. And how ethical is that to criticize it and then supporting their voting yes for their constitution?
Are you referring to 1982 constitution?
1982, yeah. And Fethullah movements voting yes for the constitution. And one example for one person who was denied education in Turkey for any reason.
Okay, let me clarify. My claim was that for many decades in Turkish Republic, people have been discriminated against in government positions for their worldviews. Things such as whether they are praying or not was checked. And if it was determined that they are praying, for instance, they were denied the job, or if it is found afterwards, they were fired. And there are thousands of examples of this. I mean, there are books written on this, and it is a phenomenon that is not debatable. I did not refer to education, denying education, but that also occurred because of the issue with the headscarf. And I mean, if you want to see evidence, go to Austria. And why would you find thousands of headscarf girls in Austria getting education there? If not, they are denied in Turkey. And it is, I don't think this is something that is debatable. It is very clear that many thousands of girls were denied educational opportunity because they wanted to wear the headscarf in Turkey. And this is, contrary to what Joshua writes, I think this is a very, very much human rights issue. And it's not an Islamic issue. Okay. The second point was the 1982 Constitution. In that Constitution, to my knowledge, Mr. Gülen did not advocate voting yes. As far as I remember, he advocated saying no. You might be referring to some positive remarks he made after the coup, and then the military junta stopping the terror. In one article, I think he made a positive comment about them stopping the terror on the streets. But to my knowledge, he did not advocate saying yes to the Constitution in 1982. If you have a reference for that, I would be very interested in learning about that. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, I'd hoped we would settle everything, but it turns out to be a rather complex set of issues here, as we knew it would be coming in. But I think we have had an excellent discussion here. Appreciate your. Did you have a? You actually had a. Oh, I thought you had maybe a final benediction. But want to thank you very much for coming, and thank our two speakers for their excellent presentation.
Thank you, Justin. It's great. It's not that I don't think it's a human rights issue. Pardon.
It's not that I don't think it's a human rights issue. It's that, again, I'm operating from Western social sciences. I'm looking at